All right, welcome back to another lecture video. This one we are going to go over Kate Chopin and her story, The Story of an Hour, and this will again help you kind of understand some of the analysis with the story. So Chopin was born February 8th, 1851 and died August 22nd, 1904. She was originally born Catherine O'Flaherty. She's considered to be the interpreter of New Orleans culture. There was a great revival of her interest in her work, which began in the late 20th century, so the late 1900s. So she had a lot to do with freedom of women and early feminist literary themes, which during the 1980s, feminist theory really began to take off. You had Roe v. Wade originally in 1973. Birth control started in the 1960s, the sexual revolution in the 1970s and 1980s. So all of this led to a revival in interest in, you know, rights for women. And during this time period, of even in the 1970s and 80s, you couldn't own a credit card unless you were married, if you were a woman. So there are a lot of great themes in Chopin's literature that not only talk to New Orleans culture, but talk to the way of life for women during her time period of the late 1800s, as well as something that could be connected to during the 1900s, even up till today by many women. Her most famous story is the novel The Awakening. It was banned when it was published in 1899 and it spent 50 years or more out of print. This is a famous one that is read during Banned Book Week, which is September 22nd to the 28th, and they like to celebrate this story. The reason it was banned is because it features a woman who leaves her husband and children, has an extramarital affair, and when all of that starts to fall through and she's told you are going to return to your life as a wife and mother, or else she decides that she would rather kill herself rather than return to her duties as a wife and mother. So it was considered extremely taboo, not even for the idea of suicide, but just the fact that a woman would choose that over her duties as a wife and mother was scandalous. She married Oscar Chapin in 1970. They lived together in Louisiana until his death in 1882, and she began to write about Creole and Cajun life. So this just kind of is a little idea of what the difference is between them. Cajuns are French Canadians who fled British rule and established themselves as natural citizens in the territory, and they developed the Louisiana area before America purchased it. The Creole people are the direct European, African, and Caribbean descendants who come to the area later after it's been already established as a territory by the Cajuns. In this particular time period, the late 1800s that Chopin was writing in, um, the Cajun people are considered the country folk, and the Creole people are considered the city folk. And a lot of her stories show how there's really not mixing between the two, and a very classist um, ideology between Creole and Cajun people. So we get her story. The Story of an Hour was written in 1894, 5 years before her story, The Awakening. So again, just like usual, think about your feelings about the story. What did it make you feel? What did it make you question? Um, the audience obviously women would have been more interested in Chopin's writing during her life, and well, even beyond her life. Um, but it was definitely for a general public purpose of explaining what women felt. We get the story where a woman's husband, she's told her husband has just died in this tragic accident, and she is upset at first, and then she realizes that in his death, she has freedom. And that is, you know, compared to today where you would hope that someone wouldn't feel that way about losing their partner, that's just unheard of to think about, that you would be free in your partner's death and you find out about their tragic death and don't, you start to feel sad, but then realize that your life is going to be so much better without them. So this is basically what Chopin is saying, but it's in a much different way than we would think of today. So during her time period, you went as a daughter, you would go from being your father's property to do with as he pleased, and you would marry whom he chose for you, and then you would become your husband's property. And it wasn't about what you wanted to do with your life, and it wasn't about who you were as a person. You were known by who your father was or who your husband was. So, and a lot of that was through your last name. If you know, first through your father's last name being your last name, then through your husband's last name. We can see this in the story. Throughout the majority of the story of an hour, our main character is called Mrs. Mallard. She is known to us only by whom she is married to. It is only when she starts to realize some freedom for herself, and only her sister, who calls her Louisa, that we learn her name is Louisa or Louisa, um, that we learn her first name, that she has an identity separate of being Brent Mallard's wife. And that's only because, familiar, in this time period, you weren't known by your first name. Everything was Mr. or Mrs. this or Miss this, Mr. that. And only those who knew you well, your best friends, your siblings, your family members, they would call you by your first name, but everyone else called addressed you properly by your either your maiden name or your married name. We talked about the setting, we talked about the time period and culture and society. Some themes in this. We get language and communication. Clearly, there is a big thing about communication, because if she is that upset about her husband's death, and well, not really that upset, and more upset about her lack of freedom in being married. I mean, like I said, women were known by who they were married to after whom they were born to, and women couldn't own property. You had more rights and freedoms as a widow than you did as a single married woman, a single woman who wasn't married yet. So clearly there was a lot of non-communication between the couple, just like we have with Hills Like White Elephants, because there's a lot she wants for herself that she's not willing or is unable to share with her husband. There's also, it's a miscommunication. We're told at the beginning that Mr. Mallard dies via a bad train accident and of freak of nature, and then it was clearly miscommunication because he walks in perfectly alive at the end of the story. So, in a lot of stories, miscommunication could lead to humorous situations or could lead to bad situations depending on what's going on. There's definitely a theme of freedom and confinement. So within her marriage, she is confined to being Mrs. Mallard, versus as a widow, she has freedom. She doesn't even have freedom in the fact of, when she goes to her room, it's a very small, cramped room. She has her own room. So she may not share a room with Mr. Mallard. There also is, we're not told a lot about their relationship because it happens, you know, because it's being a short story, we're not told what Mr. and Mrs. Mallard's relationship was like beforehand. It's possible it was abusive. During that time period, it wouldn't have been considered abusive because um men were allowed to quote unquote discipline their wives if they weren't acting properly. So if he slapped her around a bit, that wouldn't have been abuse. That would have been, a man doing his duty and making sure his wife stayed in line. So there definitely could have been some abuse with that confinement. Um, she's, thinking about the story itself, it mostly takes place in one room. That definitely gives us a idea of the confinement she's feeling because we take place in that small room through the majority of the story. Time is a big theme, how quick things can happen. This title of the story alludes to that. Its entire story, all of the emotions that take place, all of the action takes place in probably less than, but takes place in 1 hour. So it shows that life is constantly flying by. Things can change in the blink of an eye. It also has a big theme of mortality, not just because, of death being present in the story, but that again, anything can happen at any time. We start with a potential train accident having killed Brentley Mallard. He was a healthy man, and yet he's taken away suddenly. But we also have this theme of mortality because we're told from the very beginning, Mrs. Mallard has a heart problem. So there's always that concern of when is her time going to be up, and it takes something sudden like this to end that. But we also get a theme of freedom and confinement in her death. So, yes, in Mr. Mallard's death, she would be free versus confined in the marriage, but in her own death, she's free. Now, it's a depressing way to think about it because no one wants to think about how they're free in death. But if she's truly that unhappy with her life, then death may be what she needs in this case in order to free her if she has no other choice to free her, could be something that Chopin is saying. For our characters, like I said, we have Mr. Mallard. We don't know a lot about him and Mrs. Mallard's relationship. It could have been abusive, it could have been um, perfectly loving. Obviously, there was a relationship between them, whether it the fact that she was able to go so quickly to I'm free shows that clearly it wasn't as loving a relationship as if she'd been able to marry for love. Maybe because they've been together a while. We don't know how long they've been together at this point. Mrs. Mallard, like I said, we know her mostly as Mrs. Mallard. We don't get to know her as Louise till the majority of the story is almost over. And even then, we only get to know that her first name is Louise because of her sister Josephine. Josephine is one of those foil characters. She's showing that, oh, she thinks her sister is upset the entire time. So it goes to show how Josephine follows the traditional ideas of how a woman should act during this time period when her husband dies. That, oh, sister, I'm so sorry. Please let me in. I'll comfort you. Not realizing her sister doesn't need comforting at that point. Her sister's planning her new life and thinking about the freedom of the birds who get to fly outside and how she's going to be free just like them. But she also helps us learn things about Louise, such as the fact that her name is Louise. Richards is really, he is an archetype character of the messenger. He brings the news of Mr. Mallard's apparent death, and he clearly is the one who brings the miscommunication into the plot line because he brings the story without knowing fully the whole story, and that is what leads to the miscommunication. Finally, we have the symbolism of the fact of hearts is a big symbolism. We're told Mrs. Mallard has a heart problem, so that's going to be a big part of the symbolism. And obviously, hearts using for love, and that clearly there isn't a lot of love in her marriage. Death, big symbolism. We get a lot of foreshadowing with it from the first line. If you and foreshadowing is something that is easier to see in a novel once or any story once you already know the plot line. So now that you know Mrs. Mallard dies at the end, you can read that first line of how that she has a heart problem and people need to tell her the news gently that her husband's dead. That is much more foreshadowing that something bad is going to happen in this novel. Why would you mention that? And obviously, again, like I said, the symbolism of an hour, the fact that anything can happen that quickly. So I hope this helps with some of the analysis of the story. Again, these are just some common agreed upon things that scholars have talked about, a lot of things from different research that people have and interpretations. You may get more out of the story that I didn't talk about. You may get not even as much as I talked about. It just depends. Everyone has different interpretations. It doesn't mean one interpretation is right or wrong. It just means whether the text can support your interpretation.